Welcome to the Fantasy Zone. Get ready.
One of my favorite games to come out last year, right at the tail end of it, was Tetris Effect for the PS4, and the reason why it appealed to me so much was just because it was a simple, brilliant merging of aesthetic and mechanics, almost covering for each other's weaknesses in a way. On the one hand, you have Tetris, a game that's about mechanically solid as they come, meticulously designed in such a way that, if you'd pardon the expression, the pieces fit perfectly together. It's been discussed whether Tetris may be the perfect video game, and it's something I can honestly get behind, but aesthetically, well, Tetris doesn't have any aesthetics. It's just a bunch of plain, featureless blocks dropping onto a blank playing field. Despite their best efforts back in the day to dress it up with a bunch of Soviet-era Russian imagery, there's just no disguising how lacking in personality Tetris' visuals are. When you really get right down to it, it's a game without any cultural ideals, notions, or philosophies behind it. It's a game an AI could have made if it were complex enough and given enough time. But then on the other hand, you have Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who directed Tetris Effect, and before that, Rez, Lumine's Child of Eden, and so on. Games that, in terms of sound and vision, are as gorgeous as they come, really becoming audio-visual experiences unlike anything else in the medium. I've never been so sucked into my TV screen quite like the way I did as I played Rez for the first time. But mechanically, they've never really been deep games, which is fine. They're meant to complement the presentation and immerse you by actually putting you in the action, but then you take the airtight rule set of Tetris and splash Mizuguchi's vision onto it, and man, it just works so well. It's a perfect marriage of gorgeous presentation and perfect gameplay. And that made me realize just how much I appreciate all the various Tetris spin-offs and interpretations that have come out over the years. Tetris is like a blank slate, an empty canvas ready to be painted over with another's vision. And it's not just in terms of artistry either. Tetris is so insanely simple that anyone can tweak its mechanics to create an entirely different experience while still instantly recognizable as Tetris. Tetris' simplicity has allowed it to be ported to just about every platform out there, contributing to its eternal longevity and appeal to the casual market while reinventing itself time and time again to stay fresh and challenging in the eyes of the hardcores. Tetris made the jump to smartphones better than most other classic video game franchises, which ended up very watered down, while the block stacking classic retained everything about itself. It's something that can be played on a game console, a web browser, a calculator. It ports so well and appeals to just about everyone that I dare say Tetris will probably outlast Mario, Pokemon, or any other game franchise, maybe even entire genres. So with all this in mind, I kind of wanted to take a look at a couple different Tetris games to see the wild and imaginative ideas people had to build on this simple concept. Trust me, it gets crazier than you might think. Our first game is probably the best known of the lot, being a classic amongst Tetris fanatics for years, and now reaching a wider audience thanks to some impressive performances on Games Done Quick. The Tetris Grandmaster series, developed by Eureka and released by various publishers, does for Tetris what the bullet hell genre does for shoot-'em-ups. It takes the rather simple, addictive gameplay and cranks it up to 11, making you stack and clear rows at blistering speeds right from the get-go. Games that wear their difficulty on their sleeves are always kind of fascinating, but you would never in a million years think a game like Tetris would be capable of fitting this. The third game in particular is just shameless about this fact, giving it the subtitle of Terror Instinct, and having a poster that looks like, well, this. Such is the insane difficulty of TGM3 in particular that only 6 people in the entire world have achieved the highest rank, the Game Master rank. The latest GM, Kevin DDR, is the first American to completely conquer the game, having done so in 2015. You might recognize him as the guy who made TGM known to the wider public by running it at AGDQ. So how does a game become so viciously difficult that only 6 people have gotten to the highest possible grade? Well, besides the pieces practically teleporting into the well, the game also systematically strips away the player's ability to anticipate what's coming. To start, they remove the ghost piece that appears at the bottom of the well telling you where the Tetraminos are going to land. High-skill players won't even notice or care, but it throws off newcomers who rely on it almost like a natural selection for who can seek the highest score. There's a section in Terror Instinct where the Tetraminos lose their color, making it so that you can no longer tell which Tetramino is coming out of the corner of your eye, since they're always color-coded to each shape. It's also a neat tribute to Tetris' origins as an ASCII computer game. Probably most infamous of all, the final stretch of Terror Instinct has an endurance run against the game's credits where the blocks turn invisible upon landing, requiring you to memorize the layout of your pieces, all while the speed refuses to let up. But perhaps most cruel of all is the Toriken mechanic. If the player fails to meet a certain requirement of progression by a certain time, you'll get game overed immediately later on. It's pretty clear that Grandmaster is intended only for the most sadistic of Tetris players, meaning it has a higher barrier of entry compared to other Tetris games. But since it retains its iconic rule set and gameplay, it's still familiar to everyone, not requiring anyone to learn a bulk of information in order to start playing. Sure, there are advanced techniques that the highest ranking players utilize, but it's possible for a player to start just by setting out for their own personal best, making it easy to play, difficult to master, just like some of the finest video games ever crafted. The games are also fairly generous about lock delay, which is that thing where you can keep spinning and sliding your block even after it taps solid ground, so there's more wiggle room than you might think. But thanks to the aforementioned Toriken, it can't be abused or your run will be cut short, so even though the game is merciful, you still need to avoid dawdling or spinning the piece around to stall for time. Unfortunately, another barrier of entry comes in the form of actually playing the game. Besides being released exclusively in Japan, the game's also tragically never received a home port.
It's almost like it'd be really nice if this game had a home version, right?
There was an Xbox 360 release also exclusive to Japan called Tetris the Grandmaster Ace, but while it's often mistaken for a port of the mainline games, it's actually a console-exclusive spin-off made to better fall in line with the Tetris company's official guidelines. The first two TGM games play fine with emulators, but the third one tends to be a bit finicky, resulting in fans making their own fan ports and clones, such as Null Pomino and Textmaster, despite stern finger-wagging from series designer and Arika vice president Ichiro Mihara. Despite this, the Grandmaster games are still worth giving a try if you've ever wanted to see what a spiced-up version of Tetris can really look like. It's unknown what's to come for the Grandmaster series, but it is noteworthy that Arika teamed up with Nintendo earlier this year to bring Tetris 99, a free-to-play Tetris take on, of all things, the Battle Royale genre, free to all subscribers of Nintendo's online service. It's fun, interesting, and it's free, so if you're already subscribed to Nintendo Online, you might as well give it a shot. Actually, I wasn't going to mention 99 originally, since it was announced in the Nintendo Direct earlier this year, after I wrote out the first draft for this video. These games are coming out so fast that I can't even keep up anymore. The next game might not be quite as favored by aficionados, but on a personal level, it's probably my favorite title under the Tetris brand. Coming out on the heels of cutesy one-on-one puzzle games like Puyo Puyo, Columns, and so on, Tetris Battle Gaiden was developed by Bulletproof Software, also responsible for the classic Tetris port on the original Game Boy. Gaiden was released for the Super Famicom in 1993, and for those of you who are just joining us, the Super Famicom is the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, making this also a Japanese exclusive. Seeing a pattern yet? I can't really say for certain why Battle Gaiden never came west, considering Tetris was still a bankable title in the early 90s. Perhaps it was the game's cutesy fairy tale setting, meanwhile the game industry was continuing to hardboil itself with titles like Mortal Kombat, which dropped on consoles just a few months prior, or Doom, which came out for computers a scant 2 weeks before Battle Gaiden's Christmas Eve of '93 release date. Other than my own personal speculations, I can't really imagine why no one bothered to pick this one up. Of course, when looking at it from a Japanese perspective, Battle Gaiden invokes a charming early 90s arcade flair from the character designs to the backgrounds. But while Battle Gaiden's appearance is unmistakably a product of its time, its gameplay does things decidedly a bit different from its contemporaries. As opposed to most versus puzzle games, which are mostly a game of endurance as you throw garbage at one another by clearing lines, Battle Gaiden ups the ante by way of its magic orb system. Whenever you clear a line with a yellow orb inside of it, you get a magic point to use. You can either use it right away or stockpile them for a better spell, up to 4 points. This is what makes Battle Gaiden stand out so much, even to this day. Each character has a unique set of 4 spells that can be used, and the various methods they came up with to dick over your opponent are really cool. You could simply take a magic point away from your foe, or you could make them unable to rotate their pieces. Get the same piece over and over, make their grid go dark and have to navigate with a flashlight, unable to push down to speed up the pieces, clear out your side of the board with a huge laser. It's just fun switching between the various characters and seeing what each of them do. However, since each character has a drastically different toolkit, that kind of leads to the one problem with Battle Gaiden, which is that it's not exactly perfectly balanced. I won't say it's busted by any means, but some characters are clearly stronger over others. Like, for example, the Pumpkin, whose name is Halloween, has a easily spammed level 3 spell where you can just take all of the orbs from your opponent. Meanwhile, other characters, such as the 5 elves known as Bit, don't really have anything that strong. Because of this, Battle Gaiden doesn't quite have the same depth that keeps you coming back time and time again, the way Puyo Puyo, Twinkle Star Sprites, or other similar puzzlers do. But it still makes for a great time with friends, just to experiment with what each character does and the crazy ways you can screw each other over. But a real stroke of brilliant game design that helps bring the whole thing together is the fact that you and your opponent share the same pool of upcoming Tetraminos rather than each having a separate one. Depending on the situation, it might be more strategic to drop the block faster or slower to get the desired piece, especially if it has an orb inside of it. Because of this, each player's attention needs to be split between their own board, the opponent's board, the number of orbs you have, and the pieces that you're fighting with your opponent to get. It makes for a busy, intense game of Tetris, but it also adds a hint of unpredictability. Unlike in other versus Tetris games where each player has their own lineup of blocks, you can't always guarantee what block you're going to get, because of the eternal variable that is your opponent, so it requires the player to improvise even more so than usual for Tetris. The character designs are really appealing and cute too, so everyone should find a character that suits them. The graphics in general are pretty nice. The effects whenever you cast a spell have this over-dramatic flair to them that's always fun. The only real letdown presentation-wise is the soundtrack, which ranges from forgettable to downright annoying on the Elves stage. Despite the tiny gripes and not being quite as good as its competition, Battle Gaiden is still a standout title in the Tetris catalog for trying to fit into the mold of a very different kind of puzzle game in an already changing industry and doing a rather fine job at it. Though it's best to go at this one with a friend, it's still definitely one to check out. It is worth mentioning that Bulletproof is still around, now under the name Blue Planet Software, and have actually been involved with a couple Tetris games not too far back. So who knows, maybe with Puyo's resurgence, a new Battle Gaiden isn't entirely out of the question. Finally, we come to our last title, and probably the most unassuming out of all of them if you were to just look at the title, Tetris 64. It's understandable if you're confused by its rather generic name, but this is not the same as the rather vanilla new Tetris, which was only really noteworthy for being one of the first Tetris titles to support a 4-player battle mode, as well as having some, well, interesting messages hidden in the game's code. Being almost a counterpart of sorts to the new Tetris, which was North American exclusive, Tetris 64 was a Japan exclusive released a year earlier, made by Canadian developers Amtex. 64 doesn't look like a whole lot at first glance, mostly due to its dull, compressed 90s stock photo visuals and generic music, especially when compared to the far more visually interesting titles available on the platform. But where 64 really shines is in its individual modes. Like its American brother, 64 offers the usual Tetris experience, complete with up to 4 players, but its side modes are decidedly different. To start with, there's Giga Tetris, a mode where the Tetraminos will occasionally appear gigantic, only to break into smaller pieces for the player to clear away. It's an amusing juxtapose to the original Tetris formula, and has a hint of unpredictability that leads to some mild excitement, but it's mostly just filler. The real showstopper is what the game calls Bio Tetris. Making use of an optional peripheral called the biosensor that you plug into the controller, you clip said accessory to your ear, monitoring your heart rate and giving you bigger or smaller pieces in conjunction with it. That's amazing, and it gets even more amusing when you bring up the fact that no other game made use of this accessory. Just Tetris 64. No health applications or Wii Fit type lifestyle programs. All that this medical apparatus is used for is a classic good old game of Tetris. Remember that vitality sensor that was supposed to come out for the Wii? I was honestly really looking forward to that thing. And not for the usual fitness stuff that Nintendo was all about during that period, but for the possibilities for third-party devs to get crazy and weird with it. A lot of people threw out the possibility of horror games measuring your heart rate, which was interesting, but the opportunity for even more bizarre and inventive stuff than that, just judging by what developers made out of the Wii Remote alone, was kind of an exciting thought. But whereas that peripheral never came out, this did. As for the mode itself, there's kind of a bizarre metagame at play to remain calm and steel yourself to keep the preferred pieces in play, though you can reverse the settings to have bigger pieces fall with a steady heartbeat. I can't vouch for how accurate the sensor is since I'm not an expert, but I have heard pretty decent things about it. But regardless of how well it actually works, Tetris 64 and the biosensor, well, exist. They weren't laughed out of the idea room or left behind on the cutting room floor, these were manufactured and sold. The fact that such a simultaneously dumb and yet awesome idea came to fruition is nothing short of a miracle. But wait, is it really? Tetris is such a classic game series that there's bound to be someone playing it regardless of what side modes or extras you throw in. Perhaps that's what emboldens developers to get so wild and inventive with the series. It's Tetris and it'll sell well, so let's just do whatever the fuck. Either way, I've barely scratched the surface, but hopefully if you considered Tetris to be a pretty passe puzzle game previously, you'll consider giving these games and some of the other million spin-offs out there a shot. Just like the blocks in the games themselves, they really do come in all shapes and sizes, so there should be one out there just for you. And with the million Tetris titles that are available out there, I'm bound to have missed some interesting ones, so let me know if I missed anything in the comment section.